The Hells Angels clubhouse didn't smell of danger. It smelled of stale Schlitz, damp ash, and the sickly sweet tang of industrial floor cleaner. When the reinforced steel door clicked open, they expected a raid. Instead, a boy walked in. 9 years old, dirt on his chin, unafraid. Tuesdays were dead tissue. They hung loose and useless in the middle of the week, a purgatory of heavy heat and hangovers inside the Hells Angels clubhouse. Dutch sat at the scarred oak bar, a rag soaked in acetone in his left hand, the brass float of a Harley carburetor in his right. He was 56, with knees that ground like ungreased ball bearings and a spine that felt permanently fused from 30 years of hardtail riding. The sharp, chemical bite of the acetone cut through the room's permanent atmosphere, a heavy, invisible smog of stale tobacco, spilled beer, and the cheap pine cleaner the prospects dragged across the linoleum every Sunday morning. Behind him, the low, rhythmic snap of playing cards hitting a table kept time. Frankie and Bobby were deep into their 4th hour of gin rummy. Frankie was wired tight, a former tweaker who had traded the pipe for a chain-smoking habit that left his fingertips the color of a bruised peach. Bobby was just large, a meat mountain of a man who moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a glacier. In the corner, slumped in a faux leather recliner that had been patched with black duct tape, sat Bear. The president. Bear was asleep, his chest rising and falling with a wet, asthmatic wheeze. The neon Budweiser sign in the window cast a sickly red glow over his heavy, bearded face. It was a fortress. The windows were bricked over or barred. The front door was a slab of reinforced steel that weighed 300 pounds, flanked by 2 exterior cameras that watched the cracked asphalt of the compound. You didn't just walk in. You rang the buzzer, you got vetted by the prospect on gate duty, and then, maybe, the deadbolt threw. So when the heavy steel door let out a deep, metallic groan and swung inward, sweeping over the gritty floor mat, Dutch didn't look up immediately. He assumed it was Tommy, their newest prospect, coming back from the liquor store with the afternoon ice. But the footsteps were wrong. A heavy biker boot strikes the ground with a deliberate rolling thud. These steps were light, sneakers, the squeak of rubber on linoleum. Dutch stopped wiping the brass float. He turned his head slowly, the vertebrae in his neck popping. Standing just inside the threshold, framed by the blinding white glare of the afternoon sun, bleeding through the open doorway, was a kid. A boy. Maybe 9 years old, maybe 10. He wore a faded blue t-shirt with a cracked graphic of a monster truck, baggy denim shorts that hung past his knees, and oversized Vans that had seen better days. There was a smudge of dark grease or dirt on his chin, and a scab on his left elbow. Dutch stared. For 3 full seconds his brain, hardwired for federal raids, rival club drive-bys, and undercover informants, simply failed to process the data. It was like finding a stray kitten in a submarine. The hell? Frankie's voice cracked through the silence. The snapping of the cards stopped. The boy didn't flinch at the harshness of Frankie's voice. He stepped fully into the dim, red-lit gloom of the clubhouse, letting the heavy steel door swing shut behind him with a resonant clang that rattled the empty bottles on the bar. "Tommy!" Dutch barked, his voice a gravelly rumble. He dropped the carburetor float onto the bar and wiped his hands on a greasy shop towel. The door to the back hallway banged open and Tommy, a 22-year-old kid in a filthy white t-shirt and an unpatched leather vest, stumbled in. He looked panicked. "Yeah, Dutch? I was just in the can." Tommy stopped dead, seeing the boy. His jaw went slack. "Who the fuck is that?" "I was hoping you could tell me, seeing as you're on the goddamn door," Dutch said, slipping off his bar stool. The pain in his knees flared, a sharp spike of reality. He walked toward the kid, his thumbs hooked into his belt loops. The boy wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the room. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, tracked over the death-head winged skull, painted massive on the far wall. He looked at the row of polished motorcycle tanks, mounted like hunting trophies. He looked at the pool table in the center of the room, its green felt stained with spilled whiskey. "Hey, kid," Dutch said, stopping a few feet away. He tried to soften his voice, but it still sounded like tires on loose gravel. "You lost?" The boy finally looked at Dutch. There was no fear in his eyes. That was the first thing that struck Dutch as wrong. Kids usually looked at bikers with a mix of terror and awe. They hid behind their mother's legs. They cried. This kid looked at Dutch the way a health inspector looks at a dirty kitchen. Bored, analytical. "My mom's car stopped," the boy said. His voice was flat, devoid of the usual childish treble. "It's smoking, out on the road." Dutch sighed, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. Just a broken-down car. A stupid kid who wandered through an open gate because Tommy was an idiot. Tommy, Dutch, didn't look at the prospect. Go out to the county road, find the mom, help her with the car. And lock the goddamn gate behind you this time, or you're cleaning the grease traps with a toothbrush for a month. Yeah, on it. Tommy scrambled past them, pulling the heavy door open and disappearing into the heat. Dutch looked back at the boy. "All right, kid, your mom's getting help. You need to wait outside." The boy didn't move. He reached out and ran a small, dirty finger along the edge of the mahogany bar. "It's hot outside." Frankie pushed his chair back. The legs screeched against the floor. "I don't give a shit if it's raining fire. You ain't supposed to be in here. Out." The boy turned his head slowly to look at Frankie. Frankie was a frightening man. Scars tracked across his cheek, neck tattoos creeping up to his jawline, eyes that were permanently bloodshot. The boy just stared at him, blinking once. "I'm thirsty," the boy said. Dutch felt a weird, unfamiliar tug in his chest. A contradiction. This space was sacred. It was bloody and violent and dirty, but it was theirs. No civilians, ever. But looking down at this scuffed-up kid, Dutch remembered his own grandson. A kid he hadn't seen in 5 years, living out in Oregon with a daughter who wouldn't return his calls. "Give him a Coke, Frankie," Bear's voice rumbled from the corner. Everyone froze. Bear was awake. The massive man hadn't moved, but his eyes were open, dark and glinting in the low light. Frankie scowled but didn't argue with the president. He walked behind the bar, popped the tab on a can of Coca-Cola, and slid it across the wood. The boy walked over, his oversized sneakers squeaking. He took the can. He didn't say thank you. He just took a sip, his eyes never stopping their slow, deliberate scan of the room. Dutch leaned against the pool table, folding his arms. "Drink up and ship out, kid. This ain't a playground." The boy lowered the can. He walked toward the center of the room, right up to the pool table where Dutch was standing. He didn't look at Dutch. He tipped his head back, exposing his small, pale throat. He stared straight up at the ceiling. The ceiling of the clubhouse was a patchwork of neglect. It was a suspended drop ceiling, the kind you find in cheap office buildings, made of fibrous acoustic tiles. Originally white, decades of cigarette smoke, exhaust fumes from bikes rolled inside during winter, and cooking grease had stained them a jaundiced, nicotine yellow. Several tiles were water-damaged, warped, and sagging with brown rings. The fluorescent light fixtures buzzed, half the bulbs dead, their plastic covers serving as a graveyard for hundreds of dead flies. The boy stood perfectly still, his neck craned back. He held the cold can of Coke against his leg. Dutch watched him. The kid's intense focus was unnerving. "What are you looking at, kid? You gonna drink that or perform a structural inspection?" Frankie snorted a laugh from the bar, shuffling the deck of cards with a loud, aggressive snapping sound. Kid's brain damaged. "Hey, kid, look down here." The boy ignored Frankie. He took a slow step to his left, keeping his eyes locked on a specific area directly above the center of the pool table, right where the light hung lowest over the felt. Dutch frowned. He felt a prickle of irritation, but beneath it, a strange, creeping unease. The boy wasn't acting like a child. There was no fidgeting, no aimless wandering. His movements were precise, calculated. "Hey," Dutch said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the fake, grandfatherly patience. I said, "What are you looking at?" The boy didn't lower his head. He slowly raised his left arm, his small, dirt-smudged index finger extended, pointing dead center at one of the water-stained acoustic tiles right beside the fluorescent light bank. "There's a camera up there," the 9-year-old said. The words were spoken softly, flatly, barely loud enough to carry over the hum of the beer fridge. But they hit the room like a concussive shockwave. Every single biker in the clubhouse froze. It wasn't a slow halt. It was an instantaneous, unnatural paralysis. Frankie, in the middle of an overhand shuffle, stopped dead. The cards hung suspended in his hands. a bridge of paper bridging his knuckles. Bobby, who had been reaching for a peanut from a bowl on the table, froze with his thick fingers hovering an inch above the glass rim. In the corner, the wet, rhythmic wheezing of Bear's breathing abruptly ceased. Dutch was leaning against the edge of the pool table. He stopped breathing. He didn't blink. The silence that slammed down on the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The ambient sounds, the drone of the highway outside, the buzz of the neon sign, the rattle of the old refrigerator compressor suddenly seemed to amplify, rushing in to fill the vacuum left by human stillness. A single drop of condensation formed on the bottom of the boy's Coke can, slid down the aluminum, and hit the linoleum floor with a microscopic splat. Dutch heard it. That was how quiet the room had become. For 5 agonizing seconds, no one moved. Dutch's mind, heavily calloused by decades of paranoia and survival, went into overdrive. It was a violent, internal contradiction. The kid's lying. He's a kid. Kids say stupid shit. He's playing a game. But he pointed. He pointed dead center, right over the table, right where we count the cash, right where we talk to the cartel runners. How the fuck would a 9-year-old know? Feds. The word echoed in Dutch's skull like a gunshot. Feds. Rico. The Alphabet Boys. The DEA. The ATF. If there was a camera there, it meant they had been inside. It meant the heavy steel door, the prospects, the razor wire. It was all a joke. It meant every hushed conversation, every argument over territory, every kilo of crank dumped out onto that green felt to be weighed and cut, was currently sitting on a server in some air-conditioned government office. It meant their lives were over. Decades in federal lockup. Concrete walls until they died. The sheer gravity of the implication hit Dutch so hard his bad knees actually buckled a fraction of an inch. Frankie was the first to break the freeze. The cards in his hands collapsed, spilling across the table. He stood up so fast his chair flipped over backward, crashing against the floorboards. "What did you say?" Frankie's voice was a ragged whisper. The veins in his neck were standing out like purple cords. He looked manic. The ghost of his meth days was suddenly right there in his wide, bloodshot eyes. "What the fuck did you just say?" The boy finally lowered his head. He looked at Frankie, completely unbothered by the screaming, scarred man lunging toward him. "I said," the boy repeated, his tone entirely conversational, "there's a camera up there, the little black dot." It blinked. Frankie reached toward his waist, a pure muscle memory reflex to grab the heavy buck knife he kept sheathed there. "Frankie, stop." The voice rumbled out of the corner, deep and commanding. "Bear." The president pushed himself up from the recliner. He moved slowly, a massive grizzly rousing from hibernation. He walked over to the pool table, his heavy boots shaking the floor slightly. He didn't look at the boy. He looked up. He stared at the tile the boy had pointed at. "Dutch," Bear said softly. He didn't look down. "Yeah, Bear," Dutch managed to say. His throat felt like it was coated in sand. "Get a chair." Dutch moved mechanically. The cynical, tired old biker was gone, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused machine. The adrenaline dumped into his system, masking the ache in his joints. He walked over to the poker table, grabbed one of the heavy, solid oak chairs, and dragged it to the center of the room. The wood shrieked against the linoleum. Every sound felt too loud. The air in the clubhouse felt thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out through the ventilation shafts. He positioned the chair directly beneath the tile the boy had pointed at. Frankie was pacing. "It's bullshit. It's a kid making shit up. We sweep this place. We sweep it every month. Jimmy bought that bug detector wand online. He sweeps it." "Jimmy is a moron," Bobby said quietly, not moving from his seat. "Flashlight," Dutch commanded, putting one heavy boot onto the seat of the chair. Bobby reached under the bar and tossed a heavy, black maglite to Dutch. Dutch caught it. He stepped up onto the chair. He was now inches from the ceiling. The smell up here was different, stronger. It smelled of dead insects, ancient dust, and the stale heat trapped by the roof. He looked at the tile. It was a water-damaged one. There was a dark brown ring right in the center. "See anything?" Bear asked from below. Dutch squinted. He clicked the maglite on, shining the bright white beam across the textured surface of the acoustic tile. "Nothing. Just water stains." "I told you," Frankie spat. "Little freak is playing games." "Shut up, Frankie," Bear said. Dutch raised his free hand and pressed his flat palm against the tile. It gave way easily, lifting off the metal grid framework. A shower of debris rained down, decades of accumulated dust. A desiccated moth and flakes of brittle insulation drifted through the beam of the flashlight, landing on Dutch's shoulders and the green felt of the pool table below. He coughed, turning his head, tasting grit on his tongue. He pushed the tile entirely out of the way, sliding it over its neighbor. A dark rectangular void opened up in the ceiling. Dutch shoved the flashlight into the crawlspace. The beam cut through the gloom. There were wooden joists, thick layers of pink fiberglass insulation that looked like spun sugar spun by a diseased spider, and the silver, ribbed tubing of the HVAC system. He swept the light slowly, left, right. "Well?" Frankie's voice was tight with panic. Dutch didn't answer. His heart, which had been hammering against his ribs, suddenly seemed to stop. A cold dread, heavy as lead, settled in his stomach. There it was, tucked neatly against the wooden joist, running perfectly parallel to a thick bundle of electrical wires, was a thin black cable. It wasn't dusty, it was clean, new. Dutch traced the wire with the flashlight beam. It ran down the joist, looping toward the edge of the hole he had just opened. Mounted to the inside of the metal drop ceiling grid, pointing directly down through a tiny, imperceptible hole drilled right into the dark brown center of the water stain on the tile, was a device. It was tiny, no bigger than a thumb drive, matte black, a micro lens, and on the back, barely visible, a microscopic green LED light blinked. Blink, blink. It was professional. It was hardwired into the building's power. It wasn't a battery-operated toy someone stuck there as a prank. It was a high-end, continuous feed optical and audio drop cam. The feds. It was the only answer. They had managed to breach the sanctuary. They had been watching, listening. Dutch felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He thought about last Thursday, Bobby dropping 3 illegal handguns on this very table. He thought about yesterday, Frankie loudly discussing a transport route for stolen parts. All of it, captured, framed perfectly by that tiny glass eye. Dutch. Bear's voice was a low growl of absolute demand. "What is it?" Dutch reached into the hole. His hand was shaking. He didn't care about preserving evidence. He cared about killing the eye. He grabbed the small black device. It was warm to the touch. The heat of electronics. He yanked. The thin black wire snapped with a sharp pop. Dutch pulled his hand out of the ceiling. He looked at the device resting in his calloused, grease-stained palm. It looked so insignificant. A piece of plastic and glass that had the power to dismantle their entire world. He stepped down from the chair slowly. The joints in his knees didn't hurt anymore. He couldn't feel them. He felt numb. He walked to the edge of the pool table and tossed the camera onto the felt. It bounced once and lay still, the severed wire trailing behind it like a dead tail. The green light was out. No one spoke. Frankie stared at it, his face draining of color until his scars stood out stark and white. Bobby slowly pushed his chair back and stood up, his massive hands clenching into fists. Bear looked at the camera, his heavy features completely unreadable, a stone monument of impending violence. The sanctuary was violated. The air in the room felt poisoned. Dutch took a deep, shuddering breath. The smell of the acetone on his hands mixed with the smell of the ceiling dust. Slowly, deliberately, the 4 men lifted their eyes from the camera on the table. They turned to look at the boy. The 9-year-old was still standing exactly where he had been. He hadn't backed away when Frankie yelled. He hadn't flinched when the dust rained down. He was still holding his half-empty can of Coke. Dutch looked at the child. The internal contradiction ripped through him again, violently. This was a kid, a dirty, scuffed-up kid from the highway. But right now, standing in the dim red light of the compromised clubhouse, he looked like a ghost, a prophet of their doom. If this camera was so well hidden that men who lived their lives in paranoid vigilance had missed it for months, how did a 9-year-old boy see it within 3 minutes of walking through the door? Dutch took a step toward the boy. He loomed over him, casting a long, dark shadow. He didn't want to hurt him, but the primal territorial fear inside him made his voice come out as a terrifying, gravelly rasp. He reached out and clamped a heavy hand onto the boy's small shoulder. The kid's bones felt fragile, like a bird's beneath the cotton t-shirt. "Kid," Dutch said, his eyes burning into the boy's pale blue ones. "Who the hell are you, and how did you know that was there?" The boy looked up at Dutch. He didn't look at the massive hand gripping his shoulder. He took another sip of his Coke. "Because," the boy said, his voice maddeningly calm, "I have one just like it in my bedroom. My dad put it there." Dutch's hand recoiled from the boy's shoulder, as if the faded cotton of the t-shirt had suddenly turned to red-hot slag. The heavy, suffocating silence of the clubhouse warped into something else entirely. It wasn't the panicked silence of hunted men anymore. It was a cold, sickened quiet. Frankie took a step backward, his boots scraping harshly against the linoleum. The manic energy drained out of his scarred face, replaced by a twitching, paranoid confusion. "His bedroom," Frankie whispered, the words snagging in his throat. "What kind of sick fuck puts a drop cam in a kid's bedroom?" "The kind who likes to know everything," the boy said. He didn't sound sad. He didn't sound frightened. He sounded like a mechanic diagnosing a blown head gasket. Factual. Resigned. He took another sip of his Coke, his pale blue eyes tracking back to the crushed black plastic resting on the pool table. "If I turn the light off, the little green dot blinks, just like that one did. It means he's watching. He watches Mom, too, in the kitchen, in the garage." Dutch stared at the kid. The internal contradiction tore at him again, sharper this time. Dutch was a criminal. He had broken bones with pool cues. He had run meth across 3 state lines. He had done 5 years in Chino for aggravated assault and slept like a baby every night of his sentence. But looking down at this 9-year-old boy, a kid with a dirty chin, a scabbed elbow, and the flat, deadened eyes of a combat veteran, a sour, acidic bile rose in Dutch's throat. There were lines. Even in the dirt there were lines. "Kid," Dutch said, his voice softer now, entirely stripped of the gravelly menace. "What's your name?" "Leo." "Okay, Leo." Dutch squatted down. His bad knees screamed, the cartilage grinding, but he forced himself to stay level with the boy. The smell of the acetone on his own hands mixed with the faint, dusty scent of the kid's unwashed hair. "What does your dad do for a living? What's his job?" Leo looked at Dutch. The boy's gaze was unsettling. It didn't dart away. It didn't seek comfort. "He wears a suit. He has a gold badge on his belt, an eagle on it." Bobby, still standing by his chair, let out a slow, hissing breath through his teeth. "Feds. He hates you," Leo added, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "He has pictures of you, all of you, pinned up in the basement. He calls you animals. He says he's going to put you in cages." Frankie let out a bark of bitter, humorless laughter. He dragged a trembling hand down his face, smearing sweat across his cheek. "Jesus Christ. It's a Fed. The kid belongs to the Fed who planted the bug. It's a goddamn setup." "No," Bear rumbled. The president's voice vibrated in Dutch's chest. Bear walked slowly from the pool table toward the boy. He was a terrifying mountain of a man, clad in worn black leather, smelling of stale tobacco and old sweat. But as he approached Leo, Bear intentionally kept his hands open, palms facing outward. "It's not a setup," Bear said, looking down at Leo. "Because if it was a setup, the boy wouldn't have told us the camera was there. Right, Leo?" Leo shrugged. His small shoulders barely lifted the fabric of his monster truck shirt. "I don't like the blinking light. It gives me a headache." Dutch watched the boy's face. The total lack of emotion wasn't bravery. Dutch had seen guys act brave before a fight. Their eyes always betrayed them, wide and darting. This was different. This was the deep defensive numbness of a creature that had learned, very early on, that crying didn't stop the pain. Showing fear only fed the predator. Dutch thought of his grandson in Oregon, a boy around this age, a boy who cried when he dropped an ice cream cone, a boy who still believed monsters only lived under the bed. "Your mom?" Dutch asked, his voice rough. "Where were you guys going, Leo?" Before the boy could answer, the heavy metallic groan of the front door shattered the quiet. Every man in the room flinched. Hands dropped instinctively to waistbands. The 300-pound steel slab swung inward, scraping over the floor mat. The blinding afternoon glare rushed in, bringing with it a wave of blistering highway heat and the sharp chemical smell of boiled radiator coolant. Tommy stumbled through the doorway. He looked pale and frantic. Right behind him was a woman. She was in her early 30s, wearing a faded yellow sundress that clung to her in patches of nervous sweat. Her blonde hair was plastered to her forehead, but it was her face that caught the room's attention. Beneath a layer of cheap, poorly blended foundation, the unmistakable, mottled, yellow-purple shadow of a healing bruise ringed her left eye. She stopped dead the moment she crossed the threshold. Her eyes, wide and terrified, swept over the dim red light, the winged skull painted on the wall, the scarred men, and the leather cuts. Then her gaze snapped to the center of the room. Leo. Her voice was a ragged, desperate tear of sound. She didn't care about the bikers. She lunged forward, her cheap sandals slapping against the linoleum, and grabbed the boy. She dropped to her knees, pulling him tight against her chest, burying her face in his neck. Leo didn't hug her back. He just stood there, awkwardly holding his Coke, letting her weep into his shirt. "Mom, you're spilling it," he said quietly. Dutch stood up slowly. The grinding in his knees was a welcome distraction from the heavy, suffocating atmosphere in the room. The woman looked up from Leo's shoulder. She saw Dutch towering over them. She saw Frankie, trembling and glaring by the bar. She saw the massive silhouette of Bear blocking the light from the back hallway. She scrambled backward, pulling Leo with her, keeping her body between the boy and the bikers. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her breath hitching. "We're leaving. The car had just died. He wandered off. We're leaving right now." She tried to stand, but her legs were shaking too badly. She slipped on the smooth linoleum. Dutch took a half step forward and offered a heavy, calloused hand. The woman stared at it as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "Ma'am," Dutch said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He kept his hand perfectly still. "We ain't gonna hurt you or the boy." She didn't take his hand. She pulled herself up using the edge of the pool table. As she did, her eyes fell on the center of the green felt. She saw the crushed black plastic, the microlens, the severed wire. All the blood drained from her face. Her bruised skin turned the color of old ash. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that sounded like a sob. "You found it," she whispered. Dutch lowered his hand. "Your boy found it." She looked at Leo, then back at the camera. A profound, paralyzing terror locked her joints. "He saw," she breathed, her voice trembling so violently it was barely coherent. "He watched it. He knows." "Who is he?" Bear asked. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer weight of it commanded an answer. The woman leaned against the pool table, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden rail. "Agent Hayes, ATF. He's my husband." Frankie let out a string of vicious curses, pacing a tight circle near the bar, his boots stomping hard. "We're dead. They're sitting in a van a mile down the road right now. They're waiting for tactical. We need to burn the ledgers, Bear. Now." "Shut up, Frankie," Dutch barked. He looked at the woman. "Hayes, tall guy, wears cheap suits, parts his hair on the left." She nodded frantically. "He's been working on your file for 2 years. He doesn't sleep. He just watches screens. Listens to tapes." She touched her bruised cheek instinctively, a ghost of a flinch. "He says the law is too slow. He says he has to gather his own intelligence." "He bugged our house," Dutch said. "It wasn't a question." "He bugs everything," she sobbed. "My phone, the car, Leo's room. If I take Leo to the park, he knows how long we sat on the bench. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until he went to the field office. I took the cash I'd been hiding in the tampon boxes. I packed one bag. We were going to my sister's in Phoenix." She looked at the severed wire, her eyes filled with fresh tears. "He didn't let me take the car to the shop. He knew it was overheating. I think he wanted it to break down. We were just trying to walk to the gas station. Leo must have seen the open gate." She looked at Dutch, her eyes begging. "If he was watching that camera, he saw Leo walk in. He saw me walk in. He saw you tear it down." Dutch felt the cold dread settle into the marrow of his bones. She was right. If Hayes was monitoring the feed and if the man was as obsessive as she said, He was always monitoring the feed. Then Hayes just watched his fleeing wife and child walk directly into the fortified compound of the heavily armed cartel runners he was obsessively hunting. And then the feed went dead. Hayes wouldn't call tactical. Tactical took hours to mobilize. Tactical asked questions. Tactical required warrants. A husband whose abused wife just ran away with his kid didn't wait for warrants. A rogue agent whose illegal surveillance had just been compromised didn't call his boss. He came himself. To clean up the mess. To get his property back. "He's coming," Sarah whispered, reading the realization on Dutch's face. "He's not bringing the police. He's going to come here and he's going to kill me and he's going to take Leo." She grabbed Leo's hand, dragging him toward the heavy steel door. "We have to go. We have to hide in the desert." "Hold it." Bear's voice cracked like a whip. Sarah froze. Bear walked past Dutch. He looked down at the crushed camera on the table. Then he looked at Leo, who was still silently holding his empty Coke can. The president of the local Hells Angels charter turned his massive head. He looked at Bobby, he looked at Frankie. Finally, he looked at Dutch. There was a long, heavy pause. The ambient sounds of the clubhouse, the refrigerator compressor, the buzzing neon light seemed to hum with a new, violent electric charge. Dutch understood the look. It was the ultimate, twisted contradiction of their lives. They were outlaws. They sold poison. They broke jaws. They lived entirely outside the boundaries of polite society, despising the law and everything it stood for. But out here, in the dark, they had their own brutal code. You don't touch women, you don't hurt kids, and you sure as hell don't let a badge come into your house to beat his wife. "Tommy," Bear said slowly, his voice dropping into a register that made the floorboards vibrate. The young prospect snapped to attention. "Yeah, boss?" "Go out back. Open the corrugated bay doors, push the lady's broken car inside, throw a tarp over it." Tommy blinked, confused. "The car?" "But boss." "Do it," Bear snarled. Tommy bolted. Bear turned to Bobby. The giant silent man was already moving. Bobby walked behind the mahogany bar, reached under the counter, and pulled out a heavy, canvas duffel bag. The metallic clack of pump-action shotguns and the dense thud of loaded magazines hitting the wood echoed through the room. Sarah pulled Leo behind her, terrified by the sudden display of armaments. "What are you doing?" she cried. "If you shoot him, they'll send the army. You'll all go to prison." Dutch walked over to her. He didn't offer his hand this time. He just looked at her, his lined, cynical face set in stone. The smell of acetone was gone, replaced entirely by the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil floating in the air. "Ma'am," Dutch said quietly, "your husband planted an illegal, warrantless wiretap in our clubhouse. He violated our charter. He violated federal law. If he calls the cops, he goes to federal prison for civil rights violations. He ain't calling nobody." He reached down and gently took the empty Coke can from Leo's hand, tossing it into a nearby trash bin. "He's coming here alone," Dutch continued, turning his eyes toward the heavy steel front door. "Because he thinks we're just a bunch of dumb animals. He thinks he can walk in here, flash a badge, smack you around, and take his boy back." Frankie racked the slide of a matte black shotgun. The sound clack-clack was sharp, mechanical, and utterly final. Frankie smiled, the scars on his face stretching tightly. "Let him come." Dutch looked back at the 9-year-old boy, the kid who had walked into a room full of monsters and hadn't blinked, because he already lived with a worse one at home. "Take the boy into the back office, Sarah," Dutch said, his voice entirely devoid of fear. "Lock the door. Keep your heads down." He turned back toward the bar, grabbing a heavy, snub-nosed revolver from the duffel bag. He checked the cylinder. 6 hollow points. Perfect. The clubhouse didn't smell of danger anymore. It smelled of a reckoning. If this gritty descent into the clubhouse grabbed you by the throat, don't write off just yet. We tell raw, unfiltered stories about the messy, violent, and deeply human contradictions of the underworld. Smash that like button, drop a comment about what you think Dutch will do next, and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who loves a story that pulls no punches. The road continues, and you won't want to miss the next story.
Hi, my name is Tran Vinh, the owner and manager of Wild Desire Fullerton. After watching the video, there's a camera up there. The 9-year-old said, "Every biker in the clubhouse froze. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of suspense mixed with surprise. It's one of those stories that reminds us how a single observation can completely change what everyone thinks they know. I especially liked how an unexpected voice became the one that made everyone stop and pay attention. One gentle lesson I took from the story is that we shouldn't underestimate people, no matter their age or background. Sometimes the person who notices what everyone else misses can make all the difference. In everyday life, taking a moment to listen carefully and stay aware of our surroundings can be more valuable than we realize. What moment caught your attention the most, and what would you have done if you were in that clubhouse? Thank you for spending time with Wild Desire Fullerton. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and maybe like or subscribe for more stories about loyalty, courage, and unexpected heroes.